Did Portugal discover the Americas before Columbus? For centuries, one date has marked one of the most significant events in human history. October 12th, 1492. On that day, three Castilian ships crossed an ocean that for generations had been regarded as an unknown frontier. At the helm of those vessels was a navigator whose name would be remembered forever: Christopher Columbus. Traditional history tells us that this voyage opened the door to a new world. But one question continues to spark debate among historians, researchers, and those fascinated by history's greatest mysteries. Because just 8 years later, another European kingdom reached the shores of the Americas: Portugal. In the year 1500, a powerful fleet commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived off the coast of what we now know as Brazil. Officially, the encounter was the result of chance, a westward deviation caused by the winds and currents of the Atlantic while the Portuguese expedition was sailing toward India. But one detail has fueled one of the greatest mysteries of the age of discovery. How was Portugal able to reach a land that no one was expecting to find so soon? Why was the Portuguese crown so determined to extend its sphere of influence westward before Brazil was officially known to Europe? And what role might an ancient military order, one that had seemingly disappeared nearly 2 centuries earlier, have played in this story? The Knights Templar. In 1312, the powerful Order of the Temple was officially dissolved. Its enemies believed they had destroyed it forever. Its castles were confiscated, its members were persecuted, its name vanished from much of Europe. But in Portugal, something very different happened. King Denis I protected many of the former Templars, and only a few years later, a new institution was born: the Order of Christ. An order that inherited much of the Portuguese Templars' property and legacy. And centuries later, it would become one of the driving forces behind Portugal's maritime expansion. Its emblem sailed across the Atlantic. Its red cross appeared on the sails of the caravels that explored Africa and reached new lands. The very same cross that accompanied Portuguese navigators throughout the age of discovery. But there is another element that makes this mystery even more intriguing: the maps. Long before Columbus, some medieval cartographers drew unknown islands in the middle of the Atlantic. They depicted lands they should not have known. Some maps portray an Atlantic that appears far more familiar to medieval navigators than traditional history would suggest. Were these merely legends, mistakes made by early cartographers, or were they echoes of voyages that history forgot? There is no definitive proof that the Templars discovered the Americas. There is no document confirming that Portugal knew of Brazil before 1500. But there is a remarkable series of historical coincidences that is difficult to ignore. A military order that survived when others disappeared. A maritime power that emerged with extraordinary speed. Ancient maps filled with mysteries. And an expedition that reached Brazil at a remarkably opportune moment. This is the story of a question that has endured for centuries. Was Brazil discovered by accident in 1500, or was it the culmination of hidden knowledge that Portugal had inherited long before? Chapter 1. The Day the Templars Disappeared. Before Portugal ruled the oceans, before the caravels crossed the Atlantic, before European maps began to reveal new worlds, there existed a military order that became one of the most powerful organizations of the Middle Ages, the Knights Templar. Their story began in the 12th century, during the era of the Crusades. In the year 1119, a small group of Western knights established a new brotherhood in Jerusalem. Their mission was to protect the Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. At first, they were few in number, poor, with very limited resources. But over the decades, the Order of the Temple evolved into something entirely different. The Templars became elite soldiers. They built fortresses stretching from Europe to the Near East. They governed vast territories. They accumulated land, donations, and immense wealth. But their greatest strength did not lie only in their castles, it lay in their organization. The Templars created an international financial network that allowed money to be transferred between different regions of Europe and the East. A pilgrim could deposit his valuables in one location and retrieve equivalent funds in another. Many historians consider this system one of the most sophisticated forms of financial administration of its time. Over the years, the Order of the Temple became far more than a military force. It evolved into an institution with political, economic, and religious influence, and it was precisely that power that would lead to its downfall. At the beginning of the 14th century, Europe was facing a profound crisis. King Philip IV of France was burdened by enormous financial problems. His wars had emptied the royal treasury, and standing before him was an organization of extraordinary wealth, the Knights Templar. Relations between the French crown and the order steadily deteriorated. On October 13, 1307, a date forever etched in history, Philip IV ordered the mass arrest of the Templars throughout France. Hundreds of knights were captured, their possessions were confiscated, their leaders were accused of numerous crimes. Many of these accusations were extracted through forced confessions, and to this day, historians continue to debate how much of the evidence was genuine and how much was part of a political campaign to destroy the order. The last Grand Master of the Temple, Jacques de Molay, was executed in Paris in 1314. With his death, it seemed that the history of the Templars had come to an end. But not every kingdom responded in the same way. While France persecuted the order, Portugal chose a different path. King Denis I understood that completely destroying the Templars would mean losing an immense reserve of military experience, administrative expertise, and valuable resources. Instead of eliminating the organization, he sought another solution. After years of negotiations with the Church, a new order was officially established in 1319, the Order of Christ. It was a new institution in name, but it inherited much of the former Templar property in Portugal: castles, land, estates, and, very likely, many of the Order's former members. This is where one of history's greatest mysteries begins. If the Templars officially disappeared, did their knowledge disappear as well? The Middle Ages were drawing to a close. Europe was beginning to turn its eyes toward the ocean. But navigating the Atlantic was an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking. There were no complete maps. Most of Africa's coastline remained unknown to Europeans. Navigators depended on knowledge accumulated over generations, the observation of the stars, ocean currents, prevailing winds, shipbuilding, cartography. And it was precisely in Portugal, under the protection of the newly founded Order of Christ, that one of the greatest maritime adventures in history began to take shape. Over the following centuries, the Portuguese would become the world's leading explorers. They would reach Africa, sail around the Cape of Good Hope, open the sea route to India, and eventually arrive on the shores of Brazil. But before those caravels crossed the ocean, one fundamental question remained. Where did all that knowledge come from? Was it simply the result of Portugal's scientific development, or did the Order of Christ inherit something far older? Because when we examine the first Portuguese voyages, one detail is impossible to ignore. The sails of those caravels carried more than the flag of the kingdom. They bore a cross, a red cross, the emblem of the Order of Christ, the very institution born from the ashes of the Portuguese Templars, a medieval military order that became the patron of the age of exploration that would transform the world. And this is where the second part of the mystery begins, because the question is no longer simply what happened to the Templars. The real question is, what knowledge may have survived with them? Chapter 2. The Templar Refuge in Portugal. When the Order of the Temple was persecuted across much of Europe, it seemed that one of the most powerful organizations of the Middle Ages had reached its end. But in a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, something very different happened. Portugal. While the Templars were being arrested in France, while their properties were being confiscated, while their leaders faced their final days, the Portuguese king, Denis I, chose a different course. He was not willing to lose an organization that had spent nearly 2 centuries defending the Christian frontiers, governing vast territories, and accumulating unparalleled military experience. To the Portuguese monarch, destroying the Templars also meant destroying one of the kingdom's most valuable assets for the future. In 1312, Pope Clement V officially dissolved the Order of the Temple. But in Portugal, events unfolded differently. King Denis began negotiations with the Church in search of a solution that would preserve much of the Templar structure without openly challenging the Pope's decision. The solution came in 1319. That year, a new institution was officially recognized, the Order of Christ. Its headquarters would be established at the magnificent convent of Tomar, a former Templar fortress that still preserves the memory of that remarkable transition. According to official history, the Order of Christ was a new religious and military order, but for many researchers, it represented something far more intriguing, the Portuguese continuation of the Templar legacy. Not because the Templars officially kept their name, but because so much remained unchanged. The same territories, the same castles, the same military traditions, the same close relationship with the Portuguese crown, and quite possibly many of the same men. The place that best symbolizes this continuity is Tomar. Originally built by the Templars during the 12th century, the complex later became the spiritual heart of the Order of Christ. Its walls tell a story of transformation. An order persecuted throughout Europe found refuge there, and centuries later, from that very place, one of the greatest enterprises of exploration in human history would emerge, Portugal's expansion across the oceans. But here we must pause and ask an important question. Did the Templars really possess secret maps of the world? Did they know of unknown lands beyond the Atlantic? The honest answer is, there is no documentary evidence to confirm it. No Templar map showing the Americas has ever been discovered. No surviving archive demonstrates that the Knights Templar crossed the Atlantic Ocean. So where did this theory come from? It emerged from the convergence of several historical facts. The Templars certainly maintained contact with distant lands. They took part in the Crusades. They developed extensive international trade networks. They possessed knowledge that was remarkably advanced for their time. And after their official disappearance, Portugal, a kingdom that would later lead the age of exploration, became precisely the place where much of their legacy endured. It is this remarkable historical coincidence that has fueled centuries of speculation. During the 14th and 15th centuries, Portugal began to transform. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer seen as an unknown frontier. It became an opportunity. Portuguese navigators gradually pushed farther down the African coast. Every voyage brought new information. Every expedition corrected earlier maps. Every captain returned with fresh knowledge about winds and ocean currents. And behind many of these ventures stood the Order of Christ. One of the most important figures in this story was Prince Henry of Portugal, better known as Henry the Navigator. Although he was not an explorer in the traditional sense, he played a decisive role as the driving force behind Portuguese exploration. Henry served as governor of the Order of Christ. Under his leadership, the Order's wealth helped finance voyages, nautical research, and ambitious expeditions. The Cross of Christ began to appear on the sails of Portuguese caravels. Those ships were more than instruments of navigation. They became symbols of a new age, an era in which religion, political power, commerce, and scientific knowledge were united in a single mission. But now another question changes the course of our investigation entirely. If Portugal was simply exploring new routes, why did its navigators seem so exceptionally prepared to master an ocean that had long been considered dangerous and unpredictable? How did such a small kingdom become the world's first global maritime power? And what knowledge lay behind its maps? Because before a caravel can reach an unknown land, someone must first imagine that the land exists. And before a new world can be discovered, it must first be drawn. Over the centuries that followed, European cartographers produced maps of ever-increasing accuracy. Some revealed astonishing knowledge. Others included islands that, officially, no one had yet discovered. Strange names, lost lands, places that appeared on maps only to vanish from later editions. Some were nothing more than medieval legends, but others continue to raise questions to this very day. Because perhaps the key to this mystery is not hidden in a Templar sword, nor inside an ancient fortress, but on a single piece of parchment, a map. A drawing made by someone who may have known far more about the world than traditional history has led us to believe. Chapter 3: The Order of Christ and the Birth of Portugal's Maritime Empire. At the beginning of the 15th century, Europe looked toward the Atlantic Ocean with a mixture of fear and ambition. For most European kingdoms, the ocean was a vast and unknown frontier, a place where maps came to an end, where stories spoke of sea monsters, mysterious lands, and unseen dangers. But for Portugal, the Atlantic was not a barrier. It was a pathway, a route to new trade networks, new wealth, and new territories. And behind this transformation stood an institution that had inherited the legacy of the Templars only a few decades earlier: the Order of Christ. In the 15th century, Portugal was a small kingdom compared with Europe's great powers. It did not possess the massive armies of France. It lacked the immense wealth of the great Italian city-states. It did not have the population of Castile. But it did possess something unique, a privileged geographic position. Its coastline faced directly toward the Atlantic, and its navigators began to pioneer one of the greatest revolutions in history: oceanic navigation. The driving force behind this new era was Prince Henry of Portugal. The son of King John I, Henry was appointed governor of the Order of Christ in 1420. This detail is crucial, because the very order that had inherited the property of the Portuguese Templars was now directly connected to Portugal's ambitious program of exploration. For decades, the Order of Christ supported expeditions into unknown territories. It financed ships, protected navigators, encouraged advances in cartography, and played a central role in Portugal's expansion across the Atlantic. The first great objective was Africa. The Portuguese gradually pushed farther south. Every voyage was a test against the unknown. Navigators faced enormous challenges. How could they return after sailing far beyond the coastline? How could they determine their position in the middle of the ocean? How could they survive constantly changing winds and powerful currents? The answers came through a combination of experience and innovation. The compass, the astrolabe, nautical charts, and above all, a new kind of ship, the caravel. The caravel was one of Portugal's greatest maritime innovations. It was light, fast, and capable of sailing closer to the wind than many earlier vessels. Its design made it ideal for exploring unfamiliar coastlines and undertaking increasingly ambitious voyages. These ships would become the icons of a new age. With them, Portugal reached places that no European kingdom had ever reached before. But another element accompanied those vessels, a symbol, a red cross displayed upon white sails, the cross of the Order of Christ. For Portuguese navigators, that cross represented faith, divine protection, and a sacred mission. Yet centuries later, some researchers began asking a different question. Why did the emblem of an order that inherited the Templar legacy appear on the very ships that explored the boundaries of the known world? Was it simply a religious tradition? Or did it symbolize the continuation of a much older body of knowledge? Here we encounter one of the best-known theories. According to some authors, the Templars may have preserved knowledge acquired through their contacts with the East. Knowledge of astronomy, navigation, geography, trade routes. And some believe that part of this knowledge was passed on to the Order of Christ. But this theory faces a significant problem. There is no documentary evidence showing that the Templars possessed secret maps of the Atlantic or knowledge of the Americas. The verified historical connection is different. The Portuguese Templars were incorporated into a new order. That order supported Portugal's voyages of exploration, and Portugal became the most advanced maritime power of its age. The mystery lies in asking how much additional knowledge may have existed behind that remarkable expansion. Throughout the 15th century, the Portuguese continued their advance. They discovered Madeira, explored the Azores, reached Cape Verde, and sailed farther along the African coast. Every expedition increased the accuracy of their maps. Every captain contributed new observations. Every voyage expanded the boundaries of the known world. But while Portugal was advancing toward Africa, something unusual began appearing on European maps. Islands that no one had officially visited, lands located in the middle of the Atlantic, places depicted centuries before Columbus made his famous voyage. Medieval cartographers did not create maps the way modern cartographers do. Their work combined genuine geographical knowledge with ancient stories, religious traditions, and information passed down through generations. An island might represent a real place, or it might simply reflect a legend. Yet some of these depictions continue to raise difficult questions. Why do lands appear far to the west? Where did those stories originate? Were they memories of forgotten voyages, or were they simply products of the medieval imagination? And here, a new chapter of our investigation begins. Because if Portugal inherited advanced maritime knowledge and developed an extraordinary capacity for exploration, then the maps themselves may be the missing piece. The documents that reveal what navigators truly knew. Before Columbus, before Cabral, before America officially appeared on European maps, For centuries, some of these maps were dismissed as little more than medieval curiosities. Others, however, have become genuine historical enigmas. Maps created by men whose names would be remembered throughout history. Cartographers who drew a world that, according to conventional history, should not yet have existed. Because the next question may be the most important of all. What did European cartographers really know before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic? Chapter 4: The Maps That Should Never Have Existed. If we want to understand whether Portugal may have known of the Americas before Columbus, we must turn to one of history's most intriguing sources: maps. Because before a ship can reach an unknown coastline, someone must first imagine that coastline exists. For centuries, maps were far more than simple navigational tools. They were instruments of power, strategic intelligence, secrets guarded by kingdoms. A good map could mean wealth, trade routes, and military advantage. And in medieval Europe, where much of the world remained unknown, certain maps began to depict features that still raise questions today. Islands lost in the Atlantic, mysterious lands, places that did not quite fit the known geography. Some were legends, others were mistakes. But a few remain at the center of one of the greatest debates in the history of exploration. The Pizzighano brothers' map, 1367, one of the earliest documents to attract attention, is the chart created by the Pizzighano brothers in Venice in 1367. This portolan map depicts several islands in the Atlantic Ocean. Among them is one that stands out: Antillia. According to medieval tradition, Antillia was a large island located west of Europe. Legends described it as a wealthy land associated with the story of the Seven Cities, supposedly founded by Christians who had fled the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. For centuries, navigators searched for this island. But one question remains: why would an imaginary island appear on maps produced by highly skilled cartographers? Was it merely a legend, or was there some kind of information behind it? Most historians consider Antillia to belong to the tradition of medieval mythical islands. Yet its presence reveals something important. Europeans were already imagining lands beyond the Atlantic long before Columbus. The Catalan Atlas, 1375. Another extraordinary document is the Catalan Atlas, created around 1375 by the Mallorcan cartographer Abraham Cresques. It is one of the greatest cartographic masterpieces of the Middle Ages. The atlas depicts Europe, Asia, and Africa with remarkable accuracy for its time. It includes trade routes, cities, kingdoms, information gathered from travelers and merchants. It does not show the Americas, but it raises a fascinating question. How did medieval cartographers manage to collect so much information about such a vast world? The most likely answer lies in commercial networks. Merchants, explorers, travelers, stories passed down through generations. Yet some researchers wonder whether additional sources once existed but have since been lost to history. Andrea Bianco's map, 1436. Nearly a century later, another remarkable document emerged from Venice: the map of Andrea Bianco. Bianco was an experienced cartographer specializing in navigation. His work reflects European geographical knowledge before the great Portuguese voyages. The Atlantic contains depictions of islands whose identities remain the subject of debate. Some scholars believe they may correspond to real territories. Others argue they belong to the tradition of medieval cartography. But the real question is not simply about the islands themselves. It is this: why do so many maps created before Columbus portray an Atlantic filled with possibilities? Fra Mauro's World Map, 1459. One of the greatest cartographic minds of the 15th century was the Venetian monk Fra Mauro. His famous world map was among the most advanced representations of the Earth before the era of transoceanic exploration. Fra Mauro compiled information from European travelers, Arab merchants, Portuguese navigators, ancient texts. His map portrays a world far more interconnected than many medieval Europeans imagined. It even depicts Africa with extraordinary accuracy. Some researchers believe he may have received information from Portuguese sailors already exploring the Atlantic. This matters because it demonstrates that Portugal was accumulating geographical knowledge decades before Columbus. Martin Behaim's Globe, 1492. Now we arrive at a pivotal moment. The very year Columbus crossed the Atlantic, the German cartographer Martin Behaim created one of the earliest surviving terrestrial globes, the Erdapfel. But there is something remarkable about it. The Americas are nowhere to be seen. For Europe in 1492, the American continent officially did not yet exist. This reminds us how completely Columbus's voyage transformed Europe's understanding of the world. Yet it also raises another question. If some Portuguese navigators already suspected there were lands to the west, did they know it before the rest of Europe? The Cantino Planisphere, 1502. Here we encounter one of the most intriguing documents in this entire story. The Cantino Planisphere, created only 2 years after Pedro Álvares Cabral reached Brazil. The map depicts portions of the Brazilian coastline. What is truly remarkable is its level of detail. Some researchers have argued that it contains too much information to have been gathered solely after the voyage of 1500. But we must be cautious. It is equally possible that Portugal rapidly accumulated this knowledge through subsequent expeditions and information collected during its Atlantic voyages. There is no definitive proof, yet the map leaves one enduring question. How was Portugal able to portray Brazil with such accuracy so soon after its official discovery? The mystery of the maps. When we examine all of these documents together, a pattern begins to emerge. Not proof, a pattern. For centuries before Columbus, Europeans spoke of lands to the west. They drew mysterious islands. They explored the Atlantic. They steadily improved their navigational techniques, and Portugal became the nation with the greatest experience on that ocean. Does this mean Portugal knew of the Americas before Columbus? We cannot make that claim. The evidence does not support such a conclusion. But we can say this. When Columbus sailed in 1492, he was not entering a world that was entirely unknown. There already existed centuries of rumors, incomplete maps, legends, fragments of information, and a maritime tradition that Portugal had been developing for generations. Perhaps the greatest secret was never a map that clearly showed the Americas. Perhaps it was something far more subtle, the gradual accumulation of small pieces of knowledge, an island here, a current there, a route known only to a handful of navigators, a fragment of information passed from one generation to the next, until one day Portugal reached Brazil. But before that voyage took place, another event would forever change the way the world was divided. An agreement signed by two great powers, a treaty that partitioned entire oceans before many of the lands involved had even been officially discovered. A treaty that, remarkably, granted Portugal an enormous region west of the Atlantic. That treaty was the Treaty of Tordesillas. Chapter 5. The treaty that divided the world before it was known. In June 1494, an event took place that would forever change the course of world history. Two of Europe's greatest maritime powers decided to divide the world between them: Spain and Portugal. The agreement was signed in the small town of Tordesillas, in what is now the Spanish province of Valladolid. The result was one of the most remarkable treaties of the Age of Discovery, because it divided oceans, unknown lands, and future territories before many of them had even been officially explored. To understand why this happened, we must go back a few years. In 1492, Christopher Columbus returned to Europe after his first voyage. He had reached lands previously unknown to Europeans. Although he believed he had arrived near Asia, his expedition marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter in history. Castile claimed these newly encountered territories, but Portugal also had interests at stake. For decades, Portuguese navigators had explored the Atlantic. They had reached Madeira, the Azores, Cape Verde. They had sailed along the African coast, and they believed that the lands encountered by Columbus might fall within their own sphere of influence. Tensions between the two kingdoms quickly escalated. The solution came through the intervention of Pope Alexander VI. In 1493, several papal bulls were issued in an attempt to divide the newly discovered world between Castile and Portugal. But Portugal believed the original proposal favoured Spain too heavily. Negotiations followed. The outcome was the Treaty of Tordesillas. The imaginary line established by the treaty divided the Atlantic Ocean. The lands lying west of the line would belong to Castile. Those lying east of it would belong to Portugal. The boundary was placed approximately 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. And here we arrive at one of the most debated aspects of the treaty. The line was not positioned in the middle of the Atlantic. It was shifted farther west, far enough that part of what would later become the Brazilian coastline fell within Portugal's sphere. For many historians, the explanation is straightforward. Portugal wanted to protect its African trade routes. It needed room to maneuver across the Atlantic. Its navigators understood the ocean's winds and currents far better than Castile did, and the kingdom sought to prevent future conflicts. But for other researchers, this detail remains intriguing. They ask a different question. Why was Portugal so determined to move the boundary farther west into a region of the ocean that, supposedly, no one yet knew? Did the Portuguese possess prior knowledge of lands beyond the Atlantic? Did they already suspect territories existed to the west? Could that information have come from ancient maps? From secret voyages? Or perhaps from knowledge preserved over generations? These questions have inspired countless theories, but we must distinguish carefully between what we know and what we imagine. What we do know is that Portugal possessed extraordinary maritime experience. Its navigators understood the winds of the Atlantic. They had learned that voyages to Africa often required sailing far away from the coastline before turning back. This technique, known as the volta do mar, the return through the sea, became one of the foundations of Portuguese navigation. Portuguese sailors discovered that ocean currents and prevailing winds could force ships far to the west before allowing them to return safely toward Europe. A route that appeared to be a detour was not necessarily a mistake. It could be the most effective strategy. This knowledge is essential to understanding the voyage of Pedro Álvares Cabral. In the year 1500, a large Portuguese fleet departed for India. Its mission was to continue the sea route opened by Vasco da Gama. It carried men, merchandise, weapons, and the banner of the Order of Christ. But during the voyage, something extraordinary happened. The fleet sailed far to the west, and it encountered a land that would forever change Portugal's history: Brazil. The official explanation is that this was a consequence of Atlantic navigation. Portuguese captains understood the winds and currents. The westward deviation may simply have been a maneuver designed to take advantage of favorable sailing conditions. Yet some researchers point to another intriguing detail. If Portugal already possessed a reserved zone west of the Atlantic under the Treaty of Tordesillas, was it truly unexpected to find land there? The treaty thus became one of the central pieces of this mystery, because it was far more than a political agreement. It was a declaration of confidence. Two kingdoms were dividing a world they did not yet fully understand, and one of them appeared especially interested in a region of the ocean that would soon prove to possess extraordinary importance. Yet the most important question remains unanswered. When Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, was it simply negotiating for a future possibility? Or was it protecting knowledge it already possessed? History offers no definitive answer. There is no document proving that Portugal knew of Brazil before Cabral. But there is a remarkable series of facts that keeps the question alive. An exceptional maritime tradition, an order descended from the Templars that played a central role in exploration, earlier maps filled with mysteries, and a treaty that placed Portugal in the perfect position to claim a land that, officially, had not yet been discovered. 6 years after the Treaty of Tordesillas, a Portuguese fleet departed from Europe. At its head was a young commander named Pedro Álvares Cabral. His official destination was India, but in the middle of the Atlantic he would encounter something unexpected, or perhaps something Portugal had been searching for all along. Chapter 6: Cabral and the Alleged Accident of Brazil. On March 9, 1500, one of the largest fleets ever assembled by Portugal departed from the port of Lisbon. Its mission was clear: to reach India. Just 2 years earlier, Vasco da Gama had achieved what had seemed impossible for decades. He had discovered a sea route connecting Europe to Asia by sailing around the southern tip of Africa. Now Portugal intended to secure that route. Pedro Álvares Cabral's expedition had both commercial and strategic objectives: to establish relations with the kingdoms of the East, to control the spice trade, and to demonstrate that Portugal could compete with the world's greatest commercial powers. The fleet consisted of approximately 13 vessels, large ships, caravels, hundreds of men, experienced sailors, soldiers, priests, interpreters, and representatives of the Portuguese crown. This was not an improvised expedition, it was a carefully planned mission. Every detail had been considered. But during the voyage, something happened that would change history forever. After leaving the African coast, the fleet followed a course toward the southwestern Atlantic. And here we arrive at one of the central mysteries of this story. Portuguese navigators already understood something fundamental. The winds of the Atlantic did not always allow ships to sail in a straight line. To return from Africa to Europe, it was often necessary to move far away from the coastline and take advantage of the great wind systems across the ocean. This technique became known as the Volta do Mar, the return through the sea. The Portuguese had learned that the Atlantic possessed its own invisible highways, routes written in the currents and in the stars. According to the traditional account, Cabral's fleet drifted farther west than intended because of these navigational conditions. Then, on April 22, 1500, land appeared on the horizon, a coastline unknown to Europeans. The Portuguese had arrived in the territory that would later become known as Brazil. The royal scribe, Pero Vaz de Caminha, described the encounter in a letter sent to King Manuel I. He wrote of fertile land, lush vegetation, and the first meeting with the indigenous inhabitants. For Portugal, it marked the acquisition of a new possession. But here begins one of the great questions of this story. Was it really an accident? For centuries, the traditional explanation has been that Cabral simply drifted off course. A combination of winds, ocean currents, and navigational decisions brought the fleet to Brazil. This interpretation makes sense. Portuguese sailors already used Atlantic routes that required large westward detours, and navigating the ocean at the time was an undertaking filled with uncertainty. Yet some historians have pointed to several details that continue to spark debate. The first is the route itself. Cabral was not an inexperienced commander. His expedition relied on decades of accumulated Portuguese maritime knowledge. Portuguese captains knew the Atlantic well. They understood the winds, they could read the currents. They were familiar with the great oceanic circulation patterns that could carry ships westward. The second element is the Treaty of Tordesillas. When Portugal signed the agreement in 1494, the dividing line already ensured that part of the Western Atlantic would fall within its sphere of influence. After 1500, that decision proved extraordinarily advantageous. The land reached by Cabral lay precisely within Portugal's assigned zone. Was it a coincidence? A logical consequence of geopolitical negotiation, or a sign that Portugal knew more than it admitted? Here we enter the realm of the most controversial theories. Some authors have suggested that Portuguese navigators may have reached Brazil before Cabral. Others argue that the Portuguese crown may have kept certain voyages secret in order to preserve its strategic advantage over Spain. This idea is sometimes referred to as the secret discovery of Brazil. But to this day, no definitive documentary evidence confirms the existence of a Portuguese expedition before 1500. We must also consider another important point. Even if some European navigator had reached Brazil earlier, that would not necessarily mean the Templars had discovered the Americas. The Templar connection belongs more to the realm of historical interpretation than to verified evidence. What is documented is the sequence of events. The Portuguese Templars were incorporated into the Order of Christ. The Order of Christ supported Portugal's maritime expansion. Portugal developed extraordinary naval capabilities, and those capabilities ultimately carried Cabral to Brazil. Yet one detail keeps the mystery alive. When the Portuguese reached Brazil, they did not seem to behave as though they had arrived in a completely unknown land. The crown moved quickly to claim the territory. Subsequent Portuguese maps rapidly began depicting the Brazilian coastline, and Portugal acted with a confidence that some researchers find striking. In history's greatest mysteries, the question is often not simply what happened, but rather, why did it happen at precisely that moment? Why Portugal? Why that route? Why that date? Why that particular region of the Atlantic? Perhaps the answer is simply the result of centuries of accumulated maritime experience. Perhaps Portugal's success was the natural outcome of technological innovation and political vision. Or perhaps there was earlier knowledge that has never survived. Lost maps, forgotten voyages, missing documents. Information deliberately guarded by a nation that understood one simple truth. Knowledge was power. Because throughout the age of discovery, maps did more than reveal the world. They could also conceal it. And if Portugal truly possessed information before the year 1500, the answer may lie in the documents that disappeared, the maps that were never published, the secrets kept by those who ruled the seas. But before we bring this investigation to a close, we must confront the central question. The question that has inspired books, theories, and documentaries for decades. Did a genuine Templar secret really exist, one connected to the discovery of the Americas? Chapter 7. The Templar Secret. Between History and Legend. For more than 7 centuries, the story of the Knights Templar has been surrounded by mystery. An order founded to protect pilgrims eventually accumulated extraordinary wealth. A military brotherhood became an economic powerhouse. And when it seemed to have been destroyed forever, it survived in Portugal under a new identity, the Order of Christ. This combination of power, disappearance, and continuity has made the Templars the subject of countless theories. Among them, one of the most famous claims that they may have preserved secret knowledge about lands lying beyond the Atlantic. But how much belongs to history and how much belongs to legend? To answer that question, we must carefully separate established facts from speculation. What we know with certainty is that the Templars were an international order. For nearly 2 centuries, they maintained connections across Europe, the Near East, and the commercial networks of the Mediterranean. They came into contact with many different cultures. They participated in the Crusades, they managed immense resources, and they developed an organizational structure that was remarkably advanced for its time. We also know that after the order's official dissolution, Portugal established the Order of Christ, and that this new order played a central role in Portugal's maritime expansion. This is where the great question emerges. Could the Order of the Temple have passed specialized knowledge on to the Order of Christ? Some researchers have suggested that the Templars may have preserved information about ancient maritime routes, astronomical knowledge, navigational techniques, maps acquired from the East, documents that have since disappeared. But to this day, no surviving Templar archive, map, or manuscript demonstrates that they possessed knowledge of the Americas. That is the crucial distinction between a historical possibility and historical evidence. So why does the theory remain so popular? Because several remarkable coincidences continue to capture the imagination. The first, the survival of the Templars in Portugal. While the order disappeared elsewhere, Portugal transformed it into a new institution. The second, the close relationship between the Order of Christ and Portugal's maritime expansion. The Portuguese ships that explored Africa and later reached Brazil sailed beneath the cross of the Order of Christ. That symbol accompanied some of the most significant voyages in history. The third, the existence of maps created before Columbus that depict mysterious lands in the Atlantic. Although none clearly proves that Europeans knew of the Americas, they do reveal a long tradition of imagining, exploring, and mapping the Western Ocean. But there are also more conventional explanations. Portugal did not necessarily need a Templar secret to become a maritime power. It possessed genuine advantages: a privileged geographical position, a long Atlantic coastline, centuries of fishing experience, extensive commercial connections, the support of the crown, technological innovation, and generations of navigators who steadily accumulated knowledge. The rise of Portugal can be explained without invoking a hidden mystery. Even so, that does not diminish the fascination, because even from the perspective of conventional history, something extraordinary took place. A small European kingdom on the western edge of the continent built a maritime network that connected entire continents. The Portuguese sailed where others hesitated to go. They charted unknown coastlines, crossed vast oceans, and forever changed the relationship between the peoples of the world. Perhaps Portugal's true secret was never a lost map of the Americas. Perhaps it was something far deeper: a culture of navigation, an obsession with exploration. A unique combination of scientific knowledge, political ambition, and institutional support. And within that story, the Order of Christ played a vital role. But one final question remains. If Portugal possessed such extensive maritime experience, if its navigators understood the winds of the Atlantic, if its maps became increasingly accurate, why does history remember Christopher Columbus as the great discoverer of the Americas? The answer lies in the difference between reaching a place and changing history. Columbus was not the first human being to reach the Americas. Indigenous peoples had lived there for thousands of years, nor was he necessarily the first European. The Vikings had reached North America centuries earlier, but his voyage of 1492 created sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. It opened a new era. It transformed the global economy. It reshaped empires, and it altered the course of history. Portugal, meanwhile, followed its own path. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral reached Brazil. Centuries of Portuguese presence in the Americas followed. Brazil would become the largest colony of the Portuguese Empire. And so we return to the question that began our investigation. Did Portugal reach the Americas before Columbus? The answer depends on what we mean by the Americas. If we are speaking of the continent as a whole, Columbus's arrival came long after thousands of years of indigenous habitation and after possible earlier contacts that historians continue to debate. If we are speaking specifically of Brazil, the officially recognized Portuguese arrival was Pedro Álvares Cabral's voyage in 1500. But if we ask whether Portugal may have possessed earlier information, then we enter a realm where maps, treaties, and historical coincidences continue to raise compelling questions. Because perhaps history's greatest mysteries are not found in what we know. They are found in the empty spaces, in the documents that have been lost, in the voyages that were never recorded, and in the questions that remain unanswered. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral reached the shores of Brazil. According to the official historical record, that was the moment Portugal encountered a new land. But behind that date, one question still remains. Was Brazil the unexpected discovery of a navigator, or the final piece of knowledge accumulated over generations? Perhaps we will never know the whole truth. Perhaps some of the Atlantic's secrets were lost forever beneath its waters. But one thing is certain. Before maps revealed a new world, someone first had to imagine that it existed. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to discover more true stories, historical mysteries, and surprising curiosities that seem like fiction but really happened.